The Bulgarians are a mysterious people in Europe whose history, origins, and culture are not well known to other Europeans. Bulgaria is also situated in one of the most politically explosive regions in Europe, and the rise and fall of their First and Second Empire has had far more of an impact on European history than most people give them credit for. Not only is the Balkans an anomaly in Europe, but the Bulgarian people are an anomaly from the rest of Europe as well, with their ethnic origins being fiercely contested and debated by their nationalists and neighbors. The original Bulgars are commonly believed to have been a Turkic people from the steppes of Eurasia, not too far from where the ancestors of the Hungarians came from in the Ural regions of Eurasia, and they established the First Bulgarian Empire, which does roughly correspond to the modern state of Bulgaria and its territorial boundaries in the southeast of Europe. But this First Bulgarian Empire shouldn't be confused with the modern Bulgarian state, and the people who founded this empire shouldn't be confused with the modern Bulgarian people of today. The start of the 6th century AD in the Western world kickstarted the migration period in the European continent, where various Germanic and non-Germanic people moved around the continent. The Slavs were one of these invaders, and they would eventually settle in the European parts of the Eastern Roman Empire, known today as Byzantine. Within the span of a couple of centuries, the pre-existing Latin and Hellenist cultures of the Balkan region were wiped out, with the exception of Greece proper, where the Hellenist heritage was eventually restored, and the Slavic languages, identity, and culture became predominant all throughout the Balkan region, although the Dalmatians of modern-day Croatia who survived managed to retain their identity and became the modern Istrian people of Croatia. It is commonly believed that a non-Indo-European group, the Bulgars, also arrived into the region at around the same era in the 7th century, so I wanted to figure out who the Proto-Bulgars really were, what were their origins, who were these Turkic speakers called the Proto-Bulgars who entered the Balkans during the migration period in Europe and formed the Bulgarian state in Europe and had Khans as their leaders. There are a lot of misconceptions and half-truths and mistakes in explaining who these Bulgars were and who the Bulgarian people initially were. Now, some of the stuff I'm going to say here may upset and offend some people, but I hope you'll understand my points. So there is a misconception. The original Bulgars were more or less Central Asians from the Eurasian steppes, but both the original Bulgars and the European Bulgarians of Bulgaria were both influenced by Indo-European and European farmer and European hunter-gatherer genes, and they cluster with modern Europeans to a lesser extent, but they were more or less what can be construed as a Central Asian steppe population. And they spoke a Turkic language, they lived in yurts, and they were Tengrists. They culturally clustered closest with Turkics and Mongolians and spent most of their time moving locations and migrating through their horses, herding their cattle, and living in yurts, and worshipping Tangra, common to all the Turkic and Mongolian tribes of Central Asia. Bulgaria derives from a Turkic word denoting the 5 clans of the Proto-Bulgars. And also remember that when you think of Iran, you shouldn't just be thinking about Persian or Indo-Iranian culture, but Turkic culture as well, in order to remind yourself that this is a multi-ethnic civilization. However, they were not solely Turkic or Tatars. There was definitely a lot of mixing that went on during their time in the steppes. This period is very hazy, and the Proto-Bulgars are still mysterious to us. These people may have worshipped Turkic and Mongolian gods, and they spoke a Turkic language, but Italians also worshipped Greek gods too, and French was the core language of the monarchies of Europe. But does that mean that any of the people that were part of this legacy were Greek and French? Sometimes the simplest explanation is the best when dealing with people we have very little information on. At the same time, the lack of any East Asian or Turkic genes in the contemporary Bulgarians, and the lack of eyewitness accounts from the medieval era that confirm whether the Proto-Bulgars resembled Turks or Mongolians or not, and the ancient DNA samples found in modern-day Bulgaria that show genetic continuity between the Iron Age population of the region and the contemporary Bulgarians, particularly from Eurogenes, raises questions about the Proto-Bulgars being Turkic in origin. So because of this, a new scholarly tendency has been emerging that argues that the Proto-Bulgars might have been Iranic in origin and not Turkic in origin. This theory is not widely accepted in Bulgaria, but it's popular in some portions of the academic community. This might be largely due to the anti-Turkism present in Bulgaria and the negative legacy of the Ottoman Empire, which makes the Bulgarians want nothing to do with the Turkic world. On the other hand, the evidence for this theory does exist, and the case is compelling. Genetic and archaeological work has uncovered a lot in recent years. Their precise place of origin in Central Asia is usually placed in Afghanistan or Iran and the Pamir mountain range and Hindu Kush region, roughly modern northern Afghanistan and modern southern Tajikistan. The early Iranians had Nordic features and were Europeans in a pre-modern sense, and would have clustered with modern Europeans to a lesser extent. The ancestors of the Indo-Iranians, the Santashta people, were 60 to 80% related to modern Europeans. However, the Iranian genome evolved over time, and modern Iranian people are mostly derived from the native agricultural farmers that the Indo-Iranians mixed with. The Bulgars, in particular, migrated from the first millennia AD. The first millennia BC. From the first millennia BC onwards, en masse, from their original homeland here in the Iranian lands. They migrated a lot of times throughout their history. Prior to their arrival in the Caucasus and the establishment of the old Bulgarian state, they lived in the Pontic-Caspian steppe, around the Volga River, north of the Caspian Sea. This is roughly where Volga, Bulgaria was established. By this time, they had mixed extensively with the Sarmatians and the Alans, and the other steppe people living in the Volga region. From this point onwards, we can't view the Bulgars as an ethnically homogeneous people. Steppe tribes were highly mobile troops who were mixed, but at the same time had very cohesive identities, because the harsh life of the steppes required group cohesion and cooperation with other tribes in order to survive. Their genes, customs, and language might have all been a mixture of the different cultures and tribes they interacted with, but they can be classified as a group, because living in the steppes was so harsh that it established group cohesion. The Scythians, Sarmatians, Mongolians, and the Proto-Bulgars are all good examples of how powerful identities and brotherhood and racial unity can be formed when your lifestyle consists of horse riding and nomadic cultural practices. As a group, they're still obscure, though. These Proto-Bulgars are poorly understood. Barely anything survives of the Proto-Bulgar presence in Bulgaria today. Modern Bulgarian is a Slavic language which barely has any Turkic Bulgar words in its lexicon, and it's currently only spoken by the Chuvash people within the Russian Federation. The Chuvash language is not a complete match with the extinct Turkic Bulgar language, but it's still classified alongside it, and is the only language in the Oghuric Turkic language group that survived in the modern era. There are only some customs, such as the erection of large stones, or babi, where candles are lit, and place names like the Kumchir River in Bulgaria, south of Varna, and obviously the name of their nation-state, Bulgaria. But if the Bulgarians really think that they're Thracians, then they should change their nation's name to Thrace. Either that, or make the Eastern Iranian theory official and formalized already. So the Proto-Bulgars mixed with the local Slavs and Thracians on impact and were eventually subsumed by them, which is why the modern Bulgarians and other South Slavs don't have any BMAC-derived ancestry, and you can only be considered Indo-Iranian if you have BMAC ancestry, because the BMAC, i.e. the Bactrian culture of Central Asia, is the culture that cemented and solidified the Aryan identity. and founded the Indo-Iranian cultures and languages. The reason why the genetic legacy of the Proto-Bulgars is not differentiated from the Slavs and the Thracians in the PCAs that much is because the Proto-Bulgars would have been in between contemporary Tajiks and Nordics, like the Sarmatians would have been. But they were a distinct Indo-European people from the Indo-Iranians. The Proto-Bulgars faded into other groups after their conquests, invasions, and migrations. They're not the losers of history just because you haven't heard of them or don't have enough information about them. This doesn't mean that they're not terribly important. These are the people who not only founded the first Bulgarian state in Europe, they were also people who were deeply connected to horse riding. They relied on horses and military cavalry to sustain their economy. They were tough people who were fully capable of living on limited food and supplies, and their economy relied on gains from military campaigns. They also ate raw horse meat and also drank horse milk, hummus. They can't be compared to the sedentary populations of Europe, like the people living in the urban centers of Rome at all. They were worlds apart from them. Hence, they clustered the closest, culturally speaking, with the Mongolians and the Turks and the nomadic Indo-Iranians. There's a lot more historical research on the Mongolians and the Turks. So when you think of the Proto-Bulgars, you can think of the Mongolians and the Proto-Turks to better understand who they were, because the Proto-Bulgars are mysterious to us. To better understand who they were, you can just look at the case study of the Mongolians and the Proto-Turks, who we have a lot more archaeological and anthropological research on. But anyways, the Proto-Bulgars were best at metallurgy and working with leather. They were semi-nomadic on occasion, but they created empires and states, as well as trading centers, routes, and worked for a living. They created belts with their skulls that assigned their hierarchical social system. The type of belt you wore showed what your caste was. There were several Bulgarian states established in Central Asia, but we have very little information on them. The most interesting one is the ambiguous kingdom of Bulgaria, which was located in the Pamir mountain range, Hindu Kush, and the Amudaya region, which was in the Iranian lands. This state existed around the 12th century BC, where the predominant culture of the region was the Bactrian civilization, or the BMAC culture. This BMAC culture was a progenitor of the Indo-Iranians. Well, I should clarify that. The BMAC culture had been gone for centuries by this point, but the people who would have been living in this region would have been derived from the former BMAC culture and the Yas culture as well, since the Yas culture was the successor to BMAC. But the problem with this theory is that scholars haven't been able to make a clear connection with the kingdom of Bulgaria, with the Proto-Bulgars or the Bulgarians. So this kingdom of Bulgaria being tied to them is part of a fringe theory. But aside from this, we don't know. So aside from this, we don't know much about this Bulgaria kingdom, other than the fact that it functioned as a highly sophisticated civilization by steppe standards. Also, we don't know the language that the people of this kingdom spoke in. We don't know if it would have been an Iranian one or a Turkic one. We only know that they started speaking a Turkic language by the time they arrived in the Caucasus and established the old Bulgaria that bordered the Khazars. We're not even sure if they referred to their rulers as Khans or not either, because the sources that talk about Khan Kubrat and Khan Asparokh are not Bulgarian in origin, and actually come from foreign sources who were ignorant about the steppe populations and couldn't tell the Eurasian Turks apart from the other populations of the region because of how similar all the different populations were culturally and societally speaking. The Proto-Bulgars had nomadic elements and sedentary elements, but still, their culture was mainly steppe-derived, and it was difficult to actually enforce any hierarchical caste system given the harsh conditions of life in the Eurasian steppes. They were semi-hierarchical and caste-based, semi-nomadic, semi-structured, semi-nomadic people, and definitely hybridized. They even brought elements of their steppe culture to the other regions of the world they settled or left their presence in. But their ethnic makeup, numbers, place of origin, ethnic origins, and role in the founding of the Bulgarian civilization in Europe, and lastly, their connection to the Bulgarians of today, are all mysterious and unclear. Nevertheless, though we don't have much information about who they were, we clearly know who they weren't. They had no relationship with the Slavs, or the Thracians, or the Greeks, or the Romans, or the Ottoman Turks who were of Oghuz Turkmen extraction. The Turkic identity didn't even exist. It didn't even exist in the time period where the Proto-Bulgars lived in Central Asia, at least not in the modern context. The Turkic identity formulates in the geographic regions highlighted in the east in blue, but even back then, the majority of them still lived in the Altai, Siberian regions, as well as northern Mongolia. The Turks were not in Central Asia to any significant capacity until the 10th century. By then, the Bulgars were long gone. Their migrations to the Caucasus begin around the 5th and 6th centuries. To dismiss the genetic evidence that is not in favor of the Turkic or Tatar origin story is foolish. Contrary to popular belief, the Turks were a diverse people and not ethnically homogeneous. Some were phenotypically closer to East Asians, some were phenotypically closer to Europeans or West Asians. That's not true. The original Proto-Turks, the Gauja people, were entirely of East Asian extraction. Even if you go to the Siberian and Altai regions, the people you're going to see there are mostly of East Asian extraction. And the people in Mongolia, near the Orkhon region, where the Turks descend from, are mostly or entirely of East Asian extraction. The Turks had mixed with Europeans and West Asian-derived natives of the regions they invaded, but for a very long time, however, this admixture was limited. And the early Turkic cognates, including the old Great Bulgarian state based in Crimea, were only Turkic in regards to the nature of their elites and the elite culture, whereas the majority of the native population was mostly of indigenous extraction. Now, the Slavic role in the creation of the modern Bulgarians is the most clear, because the Slavic nature of the Bulgarians is undeniable, and it's very pronounced in Bulgaria today. The Slavs originate from the Pripyat marshes, which are situated between modern Belarus and Ukraine. They were disorganized and had no political structure. They weren't hierarchical, and they were also matrilineal in their lineage. They identified to their maternal descent, and they were polytheists. As you can see, they had nothing in common with the culture and way of life of these Bulgars. The Slavs also only coalesced as a group around the late antiquity and early medieval period. The South Slavs, which the Bulgars are a part of, are separated from the rest of the Slavs by the Romanians, Austrians, and Hungarians. These people set them apart. We don't know much about the Slavs prior to the 5th century either, but what we do know is that they were not unified or politically developed. The Slavs were democratic. They didn't have any strong hierarchies or leaders. The nature of their migrations were not comparable to the Bulgarian migrations. When they migrated into the Byzantine territories, they were a bunch of tribes that were just a bunch of people, whereas the Bulgarians had a leader, Asparuch. The Slavic languages all fall into the same language family, and it wouldn't take long for a Bulgarian speaker to learn Serbo-Croatian, for instance. Bulgarians like to claim that they're the successor state to Thrace, but when the Romans and Greeks conquered Thrace, they were very successful at wiping out the indigenous Thracian language and culture and exported Thracian slaves out of their native region. By the 6th and 7th century, the Romans sealed the deal, as the Thracians were all but thoroughly Hellenized by that point, to the extent in which they're not even mentioned by the time the Bulgars arrive in the Balkans, because they wouldn't have been differentiated from the Greeks who lived in the urban centers in the Balkans. The Thracians are also mysterious to us, and everything we know about them comes from Greek sources. They suffered from poor political organization as well. Plus, they were a sedentary population. Their societal makeup had nothing in common with the Proto-Bulgars. And finally, after the arrival of the Bulgars to the Balkan Peninsula, where they decided to stay and settle in, the best scholarship supports the theory that the Proto-Bulgars became a minority ruling class elite that ruled over a Slavic majority population, failed to assimilate Slavs, and were consequently absorbed by them, and the Hellenized Thracians became overwhelmed and assimilated into the local Slavic culture and identity as well, making both people de facto extinct. And this is where I end my dissertation. Thank you for watching.